Imagine being trapped on a ship, surrounded by open sea, with no laws and no escape. Your captain rules like a tyrant. The food is gone, and every glance from the crew hides a dark secret. Welcome to the grim reality of mutiny and betrayal during the Age of Sail, where the enemy wasn't always the ocean itself, but often slept in the bunk beside you. When we picture a voyage in the great era of exploration, we tend to think of grand discoveries, maps being drawn, and new lands appearing on the horizon for the very first time. But behind the billowing sails and the songs sung on deck, there was always a shadow, an ever-present fear. A fear that lived in the eyes of the crew and kept every captain awake at night. The fear of mutiny. What fueled this fear? The answer lay in the very structure of life aboard. Punishment was constant. Captains, often appointed by the crown or by merchants with vested interests, ruled with an iron hand. There was no discussion, no debate. Orders were absolute. One misstep, one delay, one ill-timed word, and the punishment could be brutal. Whipping at the mast, being chained under the sun for days, or locked in the hold without food or light. Many of these men, sailors, soldiers, forced laborers, were not at sea for glory, but out of desperation. Some were convicts given the choice between rotting in prison or braving the waves. Others were fugitives, outcasts, men who had already lost everything and thus had nothing left to fear. They carried with them resentment, hunger, boredom, and always a hidden weapon somewhere among their rags. Adding fuel to this powder keg was the broken promise. It was common for sailors to sign on with the assurance of payment at the journey's end, or after specific ports of call. But contracts were often verbal, and once back on land, the one who promised the gold was nowhere to be found. The spoils went to the officers, while the crew returned home, if they returned at all, empty-handed. And where there is no justice, tension rules. There were no written laws at sea, no police, no courts. Justice was delivered right there, between masts and ropes, amid powder barrels and tattered sails. When a captain lost the respect or fear of his men, it took only a spark, a silent night, an outrageous order, or a punishment that insulted not just one man, but the honor of all. Then, as if the ocean itself had opened the gates of hell, mutiny erupted. Mutiny never began suddenly. It brewed in the shadows. It started in hushed corners of the deck, in the stifling darkness of the hold, where barrels of powder sat beside festering grudges. There were whispers during the night watch, glances exchanged when the captain passed, hands clasped in secret, and small groups forming like mold, creeping through the ship's wooden hull. The tension was a psychological tug of war. Some sought justice, others just wanted to survive. A few had the courage to fight, others feared death, or worse, failure, which could mean being thrown overboard. But all it took was a trigger. Sometimes it was a punishment too cruel to ignore. A sailor whipped until the skin split open for a mistake everyone knew wasn't his. Other times, it was the sudden halving of rations without explanation, or the dreaded announcement of weeks more at sea with no land in sight. In extreme cases, it was an impossible order, rowing against the tide, fighting an unseen enemy, or holding course towards certain death. And then, like a blade slicing through the calm, the silence would break. Shouts, the pounding of boots on deck, the metallic clash of sabers being drawn, and knives slamming against wood. In seconds, the ship ceased to be a vessel and became a floating battlefield. Loyal officers tried to restore order, while hungry, exhausted, furious sailors surged forward like a wave, not of water, but of blood. Knives met swords, friendships shattered in the flash of steel. Chains became weapons. Barrels were overturned to form barricades. There was no strategy, no honor in this kind of war. It was raw chaos. The crew judged their superiors with their own hands, and the deck, once a place of daily work, became a bloody tribunal. There was no judge, only strength, and the verdict was often death. That was why mutiny was so feared, because once it began, no one could be sure who would live to see the sunrise, or whether the ship would ever find its way again. One of the most infamous and dramatic examples took place in 1789, aboard the British ship HMS Bounty. Its commander, the strict and unyielding Captain William Bligh, was notorious for his near-obsessive discipline. Under his command, the crew crossed the ocean into the Pacific on a mission to transport tropical plants. But paradise had its own designs. During their stay in Tahiti, the sailors discovered something that had never existed on board: freedom, abundance, and a life without the sting of whips or the weight of cruel orders. That was where the first cracks began to show. When the time came to leave the island, many wanted no part in returning to the floating hell they had once called home. The ship's second-in-command, Fletcher Christian, seized the moment, leading a mutiny that wrested control of the vessel. Captain Bligh was cast adrift in a small boat with a handful of loyal men. Against all odds, he survived 6 weeks on the open ocean, traveling more than 6,000 kilometers to safety. Christian and the mutineers vanished into the far reaches of the Pacific, eventually taking refuge on Pitcairn Island, where they built an isolated community, far from the reach of the British Crown. The Bounty Mutiny became a maritime legend, a tale both of defiance and betrayal. Yet, it was far from unique. In the great Portuguese and Spanish voyages of discovery, mutiny was a constant threat, especially on the long, uncertain expeditions where land vanished from sight for months on end. Ferdinand Magellan, for instance, faced rebellion during his circumnavigation of the globe. In one of the most tense episodes of his journey, he uncovered a plot by Spanish officers to seize control of the fleet. Magellan struck swiftly and without mercy. The ringleaders were executed on deck, some beheaded before the entire crew, as a wordless declaration that authority at sea was not up for negotiation. Vasco da Gama also faced similar threats, particularly when the conditions on board became unbearable. Disease, shortages, and clashes with local populations pushed men to their breaking point. The solution was often violent repression and brutal public punishments. Each of these episodes proved that no matter how sturdy the vessel, it always sailed on the edge of collapse, held together only by obedience and fear. But betrayal did not always come from a mass of angry men. Sometimes it lived in a single pair of eyes, a smile, a gesture, a silence. These were the quiet treacheries that unfolded far from the gaze of the crew, without warning, without uproar. On some ships, captains fell mysteriously ill, strong and alert one day, feverish and delirious the next. A few died within days. Others collapsed dead on deck, without a mark on their body. Poison, often extracted from plants or slipped in trace amounts into food, was the weapon of those who preferred not to stain their hands with blood. More often than not, the culprit was never caught. At other times, sailors vanished into the night. No struggle, no cry for help. Gone as though they had stepped off the edge of the world. Some were quietly thrown overboard by shipmates who suspected them of spying. Others were silenced for knowing too much. for witnessing an illicit deal, a brewing rebellion, or a dangerous secret. And then there were those who sold knowledge to pirates or rival nations. Routes, cargo manifests, armament details, all in exchange for a share of the loot or a new identity in a foreign port. Sometimes, a single flag would appear on the horizon, and the enemy would strike with uncanny precision, as if they knew exactly where to hit. And they did. The most frightening betrayals came from the trusted few, a lifelong friend, a loyal first mate, or even the cook. Yes, the same man who served warm bread on freezing mornings, who smiled as he set a plate before the captain, and who spent sleepless nights sharpening a blade or plotting an ambush. These men didn't seek chaos. They sought control, to seize command, to change alliances, to alter the ship's course and with it the fate of every soul on board. Faced with so many risks, captains knew that authority could not rest on uniform or title alone. At sea, power had to be maintained with equal parts cunning and fear. Some kept discreet watchmen, trusted veterans who blended in among the crew, drinking with them, listening to their grievances, and reporting everything back to the captain at nightfall. Others ruled through raw intimidation, punishments carried out in full view of the crew, even for minor infractions. The reason didn't matter, the spectacle did. The crack of the whip, the blood on the deck, the terrified silence of those watching. It was a warning that defiance would be repaid in pain. Some captains kept secret lists of dangerous men, those with a history of insubordination or too much influence among the crew. Such men would be sent on the riskiest missions, or simply vanish. Loyalty rituals were not uncommon. Oaths sworn before the crew, hands placed on weapons or sacred documents, sometimes followed by voluntary lashes to prove courage and devotion. It was a pact written in blood. Weapons, too, were often hidden aboard, not to defend against outside enemies, but to crush any uprising from within. After all, the greatest danger might be sleeping in the next bunk, smiling by day and scheming by night. Many captains slept with a dagger under their pillow, not from paranoia, but from experience. In the end, survival at sea came down to one thing: control. Control of the course, control of the food, control of the fear. If you want to discover more dark and fascinating stories from the maritime world, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a chapter of these tales filled with mystery and adventure.